This story is told from a female's perspective. I know a lot of people talk about sleep paralysis, and that shit is scary. But I haven't heard a story yet that involves being in an induced coma and strapped down to a hospital bed bound by your ankles and arms. I will try and give a brief description of why I was in an induced coma for 2 months, and why it's a total bullshit lie that you don't dream or have nightmares when in a coma. On September 30th, 2007, I was involved in a head-on collision, and it was my fault. I was driving down Route 110 in Shelton, Connecticut, and decided to light a Newport. I was a heavy smoker before the accident, and when I looked up, I had veered into the opposite lane and hit a pickup head-on in my beloved '97 Honda Accord. I ended up pushing my Accord's front end in by 3.5 feet, and the engine landed on my lap, almost severing me in half. Plus, the windshield flew into my face, covering it completely after the airbag popped, sending my face back into the seat. Simultaneously, my airbag deployed, slamming my left arm into the exposed frame on my driver's side window. I'm not sure if you can picture it, but the driver's side window had blown out on the impact as well. If you sit back in your car and throw your arm back at an angle when the window's down, you can see how your arm can slam into the frame. And when the airbag popped, it slammed my face and mouth into the steering wheel. And like I mentioned, then the windshield flew in, covering my face and mouth, filling it with glass, while the engine at the same time also landed in my lap. The pickup had caught fire, and now my Accord, being underneath the pickup's front end, was also catching fire. I had severe burns from antifreeze and other hot liquids from the engine spraying onto my left arm. I had broken both eye sockets, both cheekbones, my nose, my top and bottom jaw, and smashed my 2 front teeth right out of my mouth. I lacerated my liver, my bladder erupted, multiple compound fractures, and 3rd-degree burns on the entire left arm, with one of the bones exposed through the skin. My pelvis from hip to hip was smashed and broken, leaving a gaping hole. I dislocated my left hip, bent my lower spine exposing my tailbone, shattered my left femur with a piece of femur bone blowing out of my left knee, making my left leg shorter than my right by 1.25 inches, breaking my kneecap, and straight up crushing my left ankle, and a few broken fingers and toes. The man I hit, thank God, was fine. He actually fled the scene out of his passenger side door, leaving me there because he thought I was already dead. Literally jumped right after the impact, and I mean right after the impact. A man named Tony, who had never been late to work, and usually takes his Harley on the weekends when it's nice out. This particular September Sunday was warm and beautiful, but since he was already 15 minutes late, he decided to take his pickup. He was cleaning out some junk from the bed of the pickup and was going to leave the tow strap behind, but then decided to leave it in there. You never know when you might need a tow strap. Irony is a weird and wonderful thing sometimes. So he pulls up in his pickup and saw that there was a horrific collision, that I was trapped in my car, and that the other vehicle was empty. He also knew that if he didn't act quick, both vehicles would blow up. So somehow, he found a place underneath what used to be my front end to tie the tow strap to. Thankfully left in the bed of his pickup. He yanked my vehicle out from the pickup, and the pickup exploded. Once the first responders arrived, it took a while, because of course, there was no cell reception on that part of the road, so someone else besides Tony called it in. The firemen, police from Derby, Shelton and Monroe, and ambulances arrived and had to cut me out of the car. It took them nearly 40 minutes to finally cut me out. I was choking and swallowing on glass and debris. I was bleeding out fast from all the open wounds and broken bones, and internally bleeding as well. They had to trach me on scene. A trach is an incision they make in the hollow part of your neck and insert a tube to help you with breathing, and then rush me to the BPT hospital. It was said I wouldn't even make it to the hospital. Obviously, they were wrong. So I'll spare you the rest of the details, because there are tons more. So a few weeks in, like I said, they had me in a coma for an endless list of reasons. Now, I was constantly trying to fight the effects of the coma-inducing drugs. Turns out my survival mode is a fight, and then a flight. Well, one of those days while I was still in the ICU, a nurse came into the room to remove staples from my left knee, and I wasn't strapped down for some reason. I only know this part of the story because the nurse and my sister told me about it. Now, before she started, I was already having a dream that was about to turn into a nightmare. In my head, I was in this beautiful field, and I mean like breathtakingly beautiful. I could feel the warm sun and could smell the fresh cut grass. I was just chilling in a wheelbarrow full of hay when I see this adorable little girl with curly hair in a frizzy dress skipping towards me. At first, I thought it might be a little cousin of mine, so I was excited to see her. But when she finally reached me, I was confused. I didn't recognize her, and she was laughing like the fucking devil, and kept taunting me about how I couldn't get up, and I wouldn't be able to stop her. I became the most frightened and furious I'd ever been in my life. And trust me, I've been through some shit before this accident, so not too much scares me to death. But this little shit starts giggling like it's some horror movie, and this adorable little girl is the serial killer. Well, in real life, the nurse was explaining to me what she was about to do, because even though I was induced, I could still hear what was happening around me. I couldn't open my eyes or speak, because my eyes were sewn shut, my mouth was wired shut, and a larger tube had been placed in my mouth and neck, and I was on a ventilator. But whenever someone would enter the room and speak to me, my heart monitor would go bananas, because like I said, I was fighting those meds hard. My heart rate would especially spike like crazy when my family came in and would address themselves to me. So that's how they knew I could hear people, just not be able to see or speak to them, to my utter frustration. But I digress. So while the nice nurse was calmly explaining that she was there to remove some staples from my knee, all I could see and hear in my head is this little adorable evil shit laughing and staring at me like she wants me to die. Now I'm trying to move, get up, wiggle, anything to try to get away from her. And this is where the nightmare really begins. She starts pulling at chunks of flesh on my knee. I'm screaming for help, and it hurts. It hurts so bad I want to cry. But the more chunks of flesh she removes, the more it hurts. Plus, I could literally smell and feel the warm blood just running down my leg, and it's so red and real. So after watching this scene, and being ignored and laughed at while screaming and begging for her to stop, I am now becoming angry, until I am fucking furious. So, in my dream, and simultaneously in real life, I shot up by the waist. With an external fixator attached to my smashed bones in my pelvis, trying to keep me in place to let the bones heal correctly, I slap, and I mean slap, the ever-living shit out of the little girl, screaming obscenities I won't even repeat right now at her, and telling her that when I get up, I'm going to kill her. And then all goes black. Turns out, I'd shot up in the hospital bed scaring the shit out of the nurse, and pimp slapped her right square in the face. Then tried to get out of bed, ripping the tube almost out of my throat, and literally trying to make a run for it. Funny thing is, my mother had warned the nurses and doctors before they even strapped me down after my first non-successful escape attempt, to make sure that I was always strapped down, because if not, I would try getting out of bed, and I would fight. I am not a violent chick, by the way. Actually, I've been told I'm quite nice, but when threatened, or feel threatened, I become aggressive, to say the least. Now my surgeons adamantly, yes, plural, had said I would have been way too sedated to try anything like that. Obviously, they were wrong. So when my parents and sister came that day, the nurse told them what had happened, and said I would be strapped down from now until I was off sedation. but that she wasn't really sure why I had jolted upright while she was removing the staples, and somehow managed not to disturb the outer hardware in my pelvis, or rip my feeding tube, or my suprapubic tube. A suprapubic tube has a tube inserted through the lower belly into my reconstructed bladder, because when you pop your bladder, it bursts like a balloon with too much helium in it, and you have to sew and piece the bladder pieces back together as best you can, which means you can't pee on your own, so you need two tubes, one in your belly, and the other tube goes in between your legs. So not only had I slapped her hard across the face and tried to break out, but I had also managed to almost remove the track tube completely out of my throat, so they had to sew it back to my neck. Not to mention I ripped a nice large hole in my throat by doing that, so the tiny scar that would have been there is now a pretty badass oval-shaped throat scar. It's entertaining to watch people try and figure out what the hell happened to my neck. Well, anyways, when I was finally awake and lucid, I started telling my family, and especially my sister, about all the nightmares I had, including the last one with the little shit in the field. And my sister Lore told me what I did to the nurse while I was having the nightmare. I felt so bad for the nurse. I apologized to her, and we all laughed about it. But every now and then, I'll get a dream about that little fucking shit. It still makes me wake up sweating, but relieved when I realize I'm just fine in my own bed at home. If you would like to read more about this accident, I'll include the link in the description. Before I get started with my story, let me just tell you about my family. I had a mother, father, and two younger sisters. Between my ages 8 and 12, we lived in subsidized housing. My father was always in and out of the hospital due to a number of health problems. Eventually, my dad stopped going to the hospital, and that worried us. He had diabetes, and eventually had his left leg amputated due to gangrene. That left him landed in a wheelchair. My mom was on disability as well as my dad, so to bring in extra income, I learned how to mow lawns at the age of 9. I had met this guy, Dennis, that became a customer of mine. He was probably in his late 30s, early 40s. He was really nice, and always gave me $20 every time I did his lawn, and even gave me snacks and drinks when I would take a break. He would always ask me about school, and how my family was doing. And always being so kind to me, I continued mowing his lawn until I was 12. Around halfway through the age of 11, things started to get weird. My dad started to get weaker, and Dennis started coming over around our house. No big deal, right? He lived right down the road, and I've known him for years now. Now, I'm a tomboy, and still am to this day, so it's rare that I wear dresses. In June, I was graduating from 5th grade, so I had bought myself a dress with the spending portion of my lawn mowing money. The day that I was trying the dress on, Dennis came over. My mom was making dinner, and asked Dennis if he would go make sure that I was okay, because I had been in the back for a while. I was having trouble zipping up the dress, and my sisters would have helped, but they were next door at my friend's house. Dennis came to my room, and didn't even knock. He opened the door, and I jumped and turned around really fast. I had my back to the door. He takes a step into my room, smiling really big, and says, "Hey, sweetheart, what are you doing? That's a really pretty dress." I laughed nervously and took a step back, while he just stared at me weird. When I was younger, I didn't know what that look meant. I'm 23 now, and now I know all too well what that look meant. He looked hungry. The wrong kind of hungry. He says to me in a small whisper, "Here, let me help you zip your dress." I was nervous, but I had known him for more than 2 years, and there was no one else to help me because my mom was busy. So I turned around and let him zip the dress up. The weird thing, though, was that as he did, he had one finger inside the dress and slowly zipped up the dress with his finger rubbing my back. I felt really uncomfortable at this point, but I didn't know why, 'cause, well, I was only 11. So I pushed past him and went into the kitchen and showed my mom. She looked at me and said, "Oh, honey, you look beautiful, but what took you so long?" When I told her that Dennis had to help me zip up my dress, her eyes widened as she looked at him sitting on the couch. She got to eye level with me and said, "Honey, next time just tell me to help you, okay? No matter what I'm doing." I didn't know why she was so worried. We had known Dennis for almost 3 years, but I agreed. Fast forward about 2 months before my graduation, and before I turned 12. My birthday is also in June. I am outside mowing our lawn when Dennis comes over. I greeted him, and he gets really close to me and whispers in my ear, "I have some extra goodies at my house if you want to come pick them up as a graduation present. And if you clean up the yard, I'll give you some extra cash." Extra cash and goodies? Heck yeah. I told my mom what Dennis had told me, and she looked uncomfortable, but told me to go ahead and not to be gone more than an hour. So I walked back to Dennis's house with him. I told him before anything I wanted to get the yard cleaned up, and that's what I did. When I entered his house, he wasn't in the living room. I called for him, but he didn't answer, so I sat on the couch and waited for him. After about 20 minutes of waiting, I called out to Dennis again, and I could swear that I heard a child crying. But when I stayed quiet, I didn't hear anything. Just then Dennis comes up from the basement and apologizes that he took so long. He said, "I was just cleaning up my basement." He kept looking nervously to the basement door and gave me $20. He then said, "I'll give you the goodies another day, okay?" I was a kid, so of course I was a little disappointed. He bent down right by my ear and said, "Oh, don't worry, you'll get them soon enough," and then kissed my cheek. Now I was really uncomfortable, so I told him I would see him later and turned to leave. He grabbed my arm kind of hard and pulls me close and tells me in a gruffy, breathy voice, "Don't tell your mother that I kissed you. It's our little secret." I should have told my mom, but I didn't. For some reason I was scared now. I didn't know what to think or what to do. From then on I started to dread going to Dennis's house to mow his lawn. I stopped going inside his house and started sitting on the porch with him. His house was set on a side street that was kind of busy, so I felt comfortable there. One day, my dad had to go to the hospital, and my mom went with him. My sisters were at a friend's house doing homework, and my mom figured I was old enough to be home alone. I knew the drill. Don't open the door for anyone but family, no friends over, call 911 in an emergency. My mom was supposed to be gone for about 20 minutes, so I decided to sit at the kitchen table and do my homework, when I hear a knock at the door, and go and check and see who it is. Guess who was standing on the other side? Dennis. He had a brown paper bag, and his hair was a mess. Our door had a deadbolt, and one of those chains that only lets you open the door a certain amount, so I undid the deadbolt and left the chain. I opened the door and said, "Hey Dennis, what's up?" He said breathlessly, "I brought those goodies over for you, sweetheart." I said, "Can I get them another time? No one is allowed over right now." He smiled and said, "Where is everyone?" At this point, I didn't know if I should tell him that I was home alone. He had been weird since he saw me in that dress. I decided to lie just a little bit. I told him, "My grandparents are gone, and so are my sisters. But my mom let my friends come over so we could do homework together. He says, "Oh, you weren't alone?" I shook my head, and he smiles bigger and says in this really sweet voice, "Perhaps I could help you with your homework. I have goodies." "I'm sorry, but I can't. I'll come over later, okay?" He looked angry upon hearing this and stormed off. My mom gets back with my dad about an hour later, and I tell her what happened with Dennis. She looked kind of scared and told me to never let him in here if I was home alone, that she was getting a weird vibe from him. I agreed. That night, I rode my bike to the library because I needed a couple of books for my homework. As I'm going through the aisles, I see Dennis. He catches my eye and starts to walk over to me. There are plenty of people in the library, so I don't think I'm in any danger. He is following me now, asking me questions about school and my parents, asking if my father is doing okay, and then suddenly grabs my shoulders and pulls me back right up against his front and holds me there and bends down to say in a raspy whisper, "When are you coming over to get those goodies?" He stands straight up, but keeps me held against his front. Then I feel something hard against my back, and I go to jump forward, and he keeps me pressed against him. I start to freak out silently, not liking being restrained. He finally lets go of me and says, "Don't forget to come and get them." As I leave the library, I see Dennis coming out of the doors. He then stands where I had my bike sitting, kisses his hand, and puts his hand where my bike was. I told my mom what happened at the library, and she told me that I am never to go to Dennis's house ever again, and that if I see him and I am alone, to get straight home as fast as possible. She muttered something like, "I had a feeling." She then called one of her cop friends to go check Dennis out. Apparently, that night he got arrested. He had 2 girls that had been missing for a couple weeks in his basement, naked and bloody. Both girls were alive, but I just sat there thinking, I did hear a kid crying that day. And then cold dread filled me as I realized he had picked me for his next victim. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. If you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, make sure you check the description for information on how to submit your stories. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you in the next video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true. We lived in subsidized housing. Subsidized. We lived in subsidized. We lived in subsidized housing. We lived in subsidized housing. We lived in subs. We lived in subsidized. We lived in. We lived in subsidized housing. Subsidized. 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 We lived in subsidized housing. So I turned around and let him drip drip it real good. There will be link. There will be link. There will be link. There will be link. There will be link.